Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Welcome to the Imaginaries, a podcast where we discuss all things imaginary under the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in between. My name is Kendra, and I am here with my co-host, Tony. Hi, Tony.
Hello, Kendra.
We are going to talk today about something very near and dear to my heart, especially, but possibly to Tony's heart. We're going to find out. We haven't talked too much about this, so we will be hearing for the first time each other's opinions on this podcast.
Yes.
We are talking about Rogue One, a Star Wars story.
Indeed.
Very recently released to film on screen in theaters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this film operates as a standalone amidst the greater Star Wars episode arc. So for those of you who haven't yet gone to see Rogue One and have absolutely no clue what's going on, although, really? This film fits in between the prequel trilogy, which we will talk about a little bit on this podcast, and the original 3 films, meaning episodes 4, 5, and 6. You know, now we have the new episode series coming after that, starring Rey, Finn, and Poe, and those begin with episode 7. So this essentially is, if it was an episode, it would be episode number 3.5. And its closing sequence, its closing scene, serves as a direct transition to the opening scene of A New Hope. So that is how close it happens in time. Like, it literally goes from the closing credits of Rogue One to the opening sequence of A New Hope.
Yeah. So,
Tony, I thought I would pose the question to you first.
All right.
Did you like this movie?
Can I give you a scale response?
Yes, and how about, before you even give me a scale response, you tell me what your general experience is with Star Wars. Are you a Star Wars fan? How did you get to know Star Wars? What's your opinion about the original series, the prequel series, and now the reboot series? I don't know what you want to call that, but yes.
The sequel series, maybe?
The sequel series? The sequel series,
sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I saw Star Wars early on. I want to say I was, definitely single digits. I saw the remastered Star Wars original trilogy, at least A New Hope, when it came out in theaters in 97, because that was I remember seeing it for my birthday that year. I remember being more scared than anything, especially of the last movie, because I believe that was the first one I saw, and that beast that's in Jabba's palace that Luke has to fight was so terrifying to me as a kid. So that's bizarrely the one thing I remember from seeing Star Wars pre-age 6 or whatever. I have seen the prequel series. I do not like it. I will not go into great detail there because I know that it is far too easy to heap a lot of scorn on the prequel series, so I will just say that I do not care for it. I really liked The Force Awakens. I thought that it was smart. I liked the sort of updating of, what everyone's been up to, what that universe has been up to, and yet a, kind of, I don't want to say a retread exactly, but a walking in the familiar path of the same sort of plot points that the first film touched on, which, were themselves very archetypal. Star Wars draws very heavily on the monomyth and, a lot of really familiar story beats and story structures. And it works for it. I'm not a big Star Wars fan in that I never really took part in any of the peripheral media. I didn't read the books. I remember playing a couple of the video games maybe back in the day, on N64 or something. But anyway, in a nutshell, that's my Star Wars experience.
Okay,
how about yours?
Now on a scale. No.
Oh,
Give me the scale
okay.
first.
All right. So on a scale with that in mind, I would say Rogue One was maybe about a 5 or a 6 out of 10.
Okay.
And now let's hear about
10 being
yours. With 10 being wonderful. Like, this is my favorite movie of the year. So
Okay.
Arrival would be a 10 out of 10 for me.
Okay.
The Force Awakens, by comparison, would probably be between about, I don't know, between a 7 and a 9, depending upon when you ask me. Like, definitely was a movie that I really enjoyed seeing. If I saw it again, maybe it wouldn't have the same impact, but it was a great experience when it happened. It made me excited for what happens next in the Star Wars universe, so take that as you will.
I will take that.
Thank you.
I especially think it's interesting that wonderful and life-changing are kind of like your number 10. For me, 10 is just like a very enjoyable film. So it's good. It's useful to have that kind of a metric for comparison. So my background with Star Wars is a little bit different. I came to the original series fairly young. I don't know if I would say it was single digits or not. My family was a little bit weird with the movies it would let me watch. Like, it wouldn't let me watch The Horse Whisperer, for example.
Why?
But it would let me watch The Lord of the Rings. So,
well, that's good.
And yet, at the same time, no Harry Potter, because wizards and witchcraft would just makes zero sense. So, so I think I watched a couple of the original series on television as they were broadcasting, probably around the holidays in Australia. And I remember when the prequel series started to come out, I did not see the first two in theaters, but I did see the third of the prequel series in theaters with a bunch of friends fairly long time after it first came out. So it was a fairly empty theater. So I was not a Star Wars uber fan when I was young. I came to that later on. And I came to it in large part because of Alyssa, who sometimes appears on this podcast. She was my freshman year roommate in college, and you couldn't ask for a bigger super fan of anything. Like, she is just a super fan of everything, and it's great. So for the first time in my life, I sat down and I marathoned through the entire 6 films that were out at that point, and really fell in love with the goofy, optimistic fervor of the films, especially the original series. It's very unself-conscious, even while it's completely self-aware of how ridiculous it is. It's a film series very at ease with its fantastical elements. So I don't know, there was a real sort of mystery and beauty to me that these films could exist in the same world that say President George W. Bush was in the same sort of really important time of my life when I was first coming out of my home and discovering the world. So it's very emblematic of my growing up years that I fell in love with Star Wars.
Cool.
The Force Awakens. I should note that I live in rural Montana and I have to drive significant distances to get to any film. So I'm usually seeing films alone and after a long drive, and I'm in this weird fugue state when I do. And so I saw The Force Awakens alone in a dark theater full of strangers, and I sobbed for a lot of the movie just because I get emotional even about it now, because Rey's character is just such a spark of joy in what was a really desolate year. And there are other films that have done really important and wonderful work, even on the same level of like being optimistic and insightful in the midst of Donald Trump.
Right.
But there was something really simple in a good way about how visionary she is, how sweet and good she is, even though she's experienced really terrible things for most of her life. So if I had a scale of 1 to 10, I would probably put the original series and The Force Awakens firmly at 10. And I would put the prequel series somewhere around 5. So I'm a little bit further up the bell curve than you are on those. In terms of Rogue One, I mean, generally speaking, did you feel like it broke new ground? Do you feel like it did something different from the rest of the series? I'm curious to hear what you say before I...
So specifically comparing it, or specifically thinking of Rogue One in the context of the Star Wars movies, do I think it did anything different?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I think that it was, what it did for Star Wars was something that I had not seen before in any of the Star Wars movies. And that was really telling a movie about Star Wars, War in the Stars.
Mm-hmm.
But what did, I don't want to get too much into that just yet. What did you think?
Well, actually, that's one of the things that I loved most about this film. I probably raved about it and got your expectations up way high, because it is a film that I enjoyed a great deal. It was, because it's a standalone Star Wars film, and none of these characters will appear in any other. None of the new characters introduced here will appear in any other Star Wars films. They had more freedom to do different things with their character arcs than perhaps you might see in a franchise character like Luke or Leia.
Mm-hmm.
I felt a more immediate sense of risk, of danger, and threat to these characters, because I mean we have the very summarical statement from Princess Leia in the original series that a lot of rebel agents died to procure the information which is procured in Rogue One. So we have this sort of threat hanging overhead, but you don't know how it's going to play out. And the way it plays out is like a D-Day landing film or a Vietnam era guerrilla war film. And there's so many ways that this film calls out the current political climate in America that it's just brilliant. This film has the opportunity to really reshape certain people's perspectives on white supremacy, on fascism, all sorts of things that we're facing in America today. Really right-wing conservative governments seeking to exert power, kleptocracies, all of these things are brought up and challenged and faced in a really beautiful way in Rogue One. So the larger political landscape of Rogue One is more daring. The things that they do with the character arcs in this film are more daring. And I know that they did extensive rewrites of the ending. And I think where they came out was satisfying for me as someone who was looking for something grittier from my next Star Wars film. The Force Awakens is really mostly a lighthearted, rambunctious glomp through the Star Wars universe. There are definitely dark moments, but people crack a lot of jokes about Kylo Ren, and he's almost a figure as much of pity and fun as he is an object of concern. Whereas in Rogue One, you never have any doubt about where the directors stand on the politics and the people being presented to us. Even while I say that, the characters are pretty multifaceted for Star Wars. I particularly love the arc that Diego Luna's Cassian Andor has. So the main characters of Rogue One are Jyn Erso, the daughter of an Imperial scientist responsible for designing the Death Star. So we have Jyn Erso and her father. There's that whole storyline going on. But then there's also this rebel, I guess you'd call him a rebel agent. He's not necessarily a pilot, although he does some piloting. He's not necessarily a spy, although he does some spying. And he is responsible for picking up Jyn Erso, freeing her from a prison, and bringing her into the main narrative plot. And then he's kind of the secondary character throughout the rest of the film. And he is a freedom fighter who has committed many evils in the service of a greater good. And that conversation is really dug into and unpacked throughout the course of this film. The gritty underbelly about what the Rebel Alliance has to do in order to overcome the Empire. The innocents that are killed, the collateral damage that happens. It's all out on the table. And that's not necessarily something that happens in The Force Awakens. At least not to the same extent.
Yeah, okay. So if I can push back actually against some of your points, I really, really love your viewing of Rogue One. With that said, I want to dig into some of those ideas in a little more detail, because all of the things you're saying are wonderful. But had you not said them first, I would have said that the movie kind of stumbles in its politics. Like, it's not super clear. The characters aren't very well fleshed out, and they're not very interesting. And it actually drops the ball when it comes to, like, showing a lot of the nitty-gritty of, like, what the rebels have to do. Like, I didn't feel like I left this movie with a much better understanding of, like, you know, the lower decks of the Star Wars universe. These are the small people who made things happen. And I like that you're praising all of these things, but I wonder, especially if we could go back to the idea of Star Wars and politics, what you really picked out as those moments that you found particularly meaningful or important that the movie was doing.
You know, I think... You know, I will say that the film relies on the motivational speech a little bit too much to change the course of events. So the third act of the film is introduced by Jyn Erso delivering a sort of a pep talk to the rebel leaders as they consider what to do about the Death Star once they found out that it exists. She wants to go find the plans, finish her father's mission. He was pressed into service. So he built the flaw that many people have pointed out in A New Hope and so on as being really unrealistic in the Death Star. He built that in deliberately so that the Empire couldn't find it, and he wanted someone to blow up the Death Star. So Jyn Erso wants to find the schematics for the Death Star so that she can finish her father's work and make sure that the Death Star is destroyed. And so she delivers this speech to the rebels. The rebels essentially consider it and say, it's too dangerous, we can't compromise our very limited power, and we choose not to engage in this. And then, you know, there's a moment where she walks out into a hangar, and Diego Luna's character shows up with this ragtag team of rebels who are like, you know, we believe you. The rebel leaders might not, but we'll follow you and we'll get this done. And that moment is rushed. I'm not gonna lie, it's rushed. Did it feel good in the moment to me with my brain switched off? Definitely. And there's a lot of those moments in Rogue One that just have to happen so the plot moves forward. And that's the limitation of doing this bridge film between series. You know, that's a weakness that's inherent to doing this. I think the connecting with characters thing, that I don't quite understand why you didn't connect with them. I'm wondering how much of Jyn Erso being interesting and important to me has to do with the fact that I am a very, very ordinary woman, and I'm seeing a very, very ordinary woman on screen doing something important. It's small in the big scheme of things, but it's important too. And every other female in the Star Wars universe is magically gifted somehow. Or sort of preternaturally smart. So in the case of Padme, she's incredibly smart. She's savvy beyond all imagining in terms of the political stuff. And then we have Leia and we have Rey. And both of them have the Force. And I think it's important to me that Jyn Erso is just a regular gal. Like, she doesn't have the Force. She just has a vision to get something done. And she has this... she has daddy issues, and so there's a lot of Jyn Erso that I think young women are going to recognize and be able to identify with. And so I found her a compelling character and a very important character because we haven't seen her before.
I guess the reason, and I really like that reading of Jin Urso. I'm looking at the character list right now. I really like that reading of Jin Urso because that scene, like, that pulls more importance out of the character than I initially read. With that said, I think that a lot of the problem I had with Jin Urso is that she felt like she was a victim of the plot. Like, this movie was not guided by her character, or really any of the other characters, but rather by needing to fulfill the plot of the movies that it was already supporting.
Yeah.
Like, this was getting us from point A to point B. And so it felt like if I can go back to that speech with the rebels scene, and then the speech with the rebel leadership scene, and then meeting with the rebel pilots afterwards, like, that stood out to me so starkly as so against the Jin Urso we'd been presented so far in the movie, because I agree with you, now that you say it this way, that she was very much like an every woman who I could step into as a viewer. But, you know, to me, it felt like up through that point, what Jin Urso really wanted was, like, to find her father, since the rebels were like, all right, we're going to find your father. She was like, all right, that sort of suits my needs. And then done. Like, what was her motivation beyond that? And then suddenly she becomes this, like, force for, like, no, we have to take on the entire empire and destroy this thing. And, like, I believe in the rebellion and I believe in its cause. And all of that just came so out of left field for me that it, like, kind of, like, ruined her character a little bit. Not ruined, but just, like, I didn't get it.
I see that the motivational speech, and of course I want to read a positive layer on it, but I see her motivational speech. I want it
to be positive. Show me your positive.
Okay. I see it as a natural manifestation of her pragmatism. She needs the Empire's help in order to get the job done, and the job is something that her father, who she has throughout the film, she's been set up as really, really wanting to honor her father and to reconnect in some way with him. And so her way of reconnecting with him after he's been taken off of the table, no spoilers there, is to carry out his wishes, explicitly delivered to her in a personal message. So the message is the important link there. He gives her his mission and basically says, you know, I love you, this is what you need to do. And so then she goes about doing it. But the only way she can get it done is if she has help, because she is an ordinary person without the Force. So I see her speech to the rebel leaders as being, hi guys, I need a ship and some soldiers. And I don't really particularly care about you guys, but I do care about my father's mission. And my father's mission was very directly aligned with the rebel mission. So the film leapfrogs through a series of bridges where, you know, they're trying to find her father, so they go through this fringe radical Saw Gerrera, who used to be a part of the Rebel Alliance but was too extreme for the Rebel Alliance, so they cast him out a bit. And they have to go through him in order to find her father. So her father bought into Saw Gerrera as a person and his vision for rebellion. So, you know, he was very clearly, a rebel, even if he wasn't part of the Rebel Alliance. And so I think the film was trying to set up this continuity where, you know, she and Saw Gerrera and her father were rebels who weren't a part of the Rebel Alliance, and they were in danger of not being able to see their mission through because they were not standard Rebel Alliance. So I think what's interesting about the internal politics that we see on screen is this notion that the Rebel Alliance was not uniform, did not have a singular vision, was really looking for that next thing, the next step to take in light of the fact that they've just discovered this massive power imbalance with the Empire. And so they're really at a loss of what to do. They essentially say, we don't know, so we're going to break up and maybe see you next year, kind of a thing. And so she appeals directly to the the grunt soldiers. And the grunt soldiers see the virtue in getting done what she needs to get done. And so they then sort of come on board with her and depart from standard Rebel Alliance policy, in a sense. So there's a lot of those little subtle moves being made in the background, which you can read either as disorganization or as a deliberate attempt to deconstruct this perfect sort of Halkian image of the Rebel Alliance as something sacred and perfect, and don't question the Rebel Alliance being good, guys, because that's what the entire original series was setting it up to be, you know. So I think it complicates matters in a really pleasurable way, and I think a lot of what happens with Jyn Erso and the soldiers on the ground is she's not consequential herself. She's not important herself. They have to band together in order to have any effect at all, and even then it's kind of a self-defeating game. You know, it's so Vietnam era literature in its understanding of how wars are fought and won. It's never the singular gifted individual who wins a war in the real world, especially when we're talking about the perspective of Vietnam era literature. It's the accidents that happen that pull a whole diverse group of individuals in to accomplish something. So yeah, I think it's a complicated movie, and on one level that could be bad, and on another level I think that's fascinating. So that's my take on it.
So speaking of that hangar scene, and also speaking of some background subtleties, why were there no women in this movie?
Well, there were.
I mean, obviously we have Jyn, we have Mon Mothma as the voice of the Rebel Alliance, we have another woman serving on the council, we have a couple of fighter pilots, but far and away, both the main character list and any face you see in the background at any scene, it's mostly men. And I just wondered what you thought about that, because I noticed it and I was like, this feels like, for a movie that is making these moves at, you know, moving the Star Wars universe, which is kind of like big feel-good adventure movie, don't really question too much that there's like absolute good and absolute evil, and like, you know, black and white do exist. It felt kind of shocking to go back to essentially this, like, you know, 70s, almost Vietnam itself, view that, like, war is no place for women. What did you think?
I didn't think it was saying that war is no place for a woman. In fact, I think Jyn Erso being the sort of missing element to the formula, to the team, is saying that perhaps women are the heart of why we do things. I still think that's problematic. That can be really, put a women on a pedestal that they either can't perform to or that they don't want to perform to. I think the women who were presented in this film, and we have to admit Leia is in the film too.
True.
They do play very important and pivotal roles. There are a lot of background characters who are men, and that I would like to see changed. I think it probably was partially intentional to harken back to this war movie genre. This is a war movie. This is Aliens to Alien. This is the Two Towers to the Lord of the Rings. This is the gritty second act of a large overarching series. It's problematic, but it's also deliberate. So to a certain extent, I honor the decision, but to a certain extent, I definitely feel uncomfortable with it too. I wonder how much of the men being, more present in the text is the fact that they were trying to present this very peculiar, and I'm just going to say it, this very gay relationship between two of her close team members. They have to be the same gender in order to be gay, and I'm pretty sure it was intentional for them to be like super gay for each other this entire movie. And the characters we're talking about, by the way, just spoiler alert here, are Chirrut Imwe, played by Donnie Yen, who's kind of he's like a blind warrior mage or a blind warrior a priest or Zen Buddhist monk kind of thing. And the other character is Baze Malbus, who's played by Jang Wen. And he's a mercenary, but he's a mercenary with a soft heart. He's definitely that archetype, and he has this giant gun, and he helps protect Chirrut Imwe. And so throughout the film, you're seeing this relationship develop, which is very new for Star Wars. We haven't had any relationship like theirs in the Star Wars universe before. So they have to be the same gender in order to make it this new thing. And that does mean that two members of her team, her closest teammates right there, are, have to be male or female. And I think either way it would have skewed the balance to the extreme. So if they'd both been women, then it would have felt like a really, really like female-driven movie, which I do not oppose at all. But,
I mean, I see what you're saying, but at the same time, if they had been women and we still had Jyn, that would have made 3 out of the 6 members of like that core team women, which is like that 50% seems reasonable. Like, and I totally get what you're saying, and yet at the same time,
I get what
sort
you're
of like
saying too.
50%, sort of like skewing it towards women is like part of the problem that we're talking about.
Sure. I think the character who could have been a woman who wasn't was Bodhi. Bodhi Rook could have been a woman. The pilot who defects, the cargo pilot who defects with this first crucial piece of information, that is a role that doesn't need to be male. I think Saw Gerrera, the extremist, could have been a female extremist in the line of something from Mad Max Fury Road. He could have been outlandish that way. Her father had to be her father, because there had to be this whole scene with her father and her mother, and the drama that happens at the beginning of the film.
Maybe, but couldn't it have easily have been her mother? Couldn't the one who is doing all this work for the Empire have been her mother? Like,
except the Empire has always been set up as very patriarchal. So they're going to employ mostly men. And that is what makes Ben Mendelsohn as Orson Krennic and the other, Darth Vader and the other Imperial characters that we get, it makes sense for them to be male, because this film is a commentary on patriarchy and its relationship to war, as well as everything else that it's doing. And it always has been a part of the Star Wars universe that it's patriarchal.
Which I like, and I mean, I like that you're saying that, because I think one of the, going all the way back to your comment about the politics that it's showing on screen, casting as the new central bad guy, an actor who is blonde and blue-eyed and surrounded by all of these, Nazi fascist images, I think was very intentional and very smart. So I'm totally with you on that part, that like the Empire, in that way, it makes more sense for her dad to have, been in charge. And again, it feels like one of the parts that's sort of undermining that, or directly challenging that, is that the voice of authority that we see again and again representing the rebels is Mon Mothma, who is a woman. But at the same time, like, it sort of feels like that core group that Jyn is a part of, but 5 out of the 6 people in that group are, well, I guess I can't really count the droid. But,
you can count the droid, played by Alan Tudyk.
Alan Tudyk.
And the sad thing for me is that, yes, K2SO could have been a woman. However, I love Alan Tudyk, and I think that's honestly why we get a lot of the actors we do in this film, is because someone, director or producer, someone along the line was like, well, this character could be played by anyone, but I have this nerd fan favorite that I absolutely must see in this role. And every actor was a really good fit for the role. That doesn't mean it's the best decision that could have been made.
Yes.
And I think so Alan Tudyk's character, Riz Ahmed's character, Forrest Whitaker's character, those could have been women, or one or more of them could have been women, and that would have balanced it a little bit more. And they're all rebels, so it would have continued this patriarchal versus matriarchal dynamic that we have in the other Star Wars films as well.
For sure. And I will say, I don't want to push back on everything you're saying. And one of the things that I did appreciate about the casting is that pretty much all of Jin's group are men of color.
Yes.
Which is really awesome. And I'm glad that the Star Wars universe, took that step at least.
Yeah, and actually,
so really awesome.
I think Jyn Erso's character could have also been really compelling as a woman of color.
Oh, absolutely.
The thing that leaving her white did is it gave us the possibility of her father being Mads Mikkelsen, and he is an excellent choice for the character of her father, Galen Erso. Everything about Mads Mikkelsen commands presence. He's a presence on the screen, no matter whether he's playing a Bond villain or a good character with a complicated past, as he does in this film. So I don't fight with Mads Mikkelsen being there, and I don't really fight with Felicity Jones being Jyn Erso. Could this have been more representational and more diverse in terms of gender equality? Absolutely. But it's still a decent film. It's not slamming the door on women the same way that a lot of other science fiction films really have. It's not going as far in the right direction as it could have, but that doesn't mean that it's a blatant failure. So that's kind of where I come down on the gender thing.
Yeah, I don't want to imply that it is. The work that it does in terms of all diversity, in terms of all sorts of representation, is good. And I want to recognize that. But at the same time, just going back to that first thing I said, it really stood out to me that both in terms of the main group of characters and the actors and the extras in the background, the fact that we don't have a whole lot of women was surprising.
Yeah. Could have been intentional, could have just been someone not thinking hard enough about their extras casting. That I'll have to wait and see as some of the extras come out and we see how the film was put together. Some of that you really can't judge just based on interviews, because interviews are not always objective. So
for sure.
So let's transition a little bit. What do you think about the longevity of this film? Do you think it matters in the Star Wars universe, in the outside of the cinema world? What do you think? That was the question I had after watching what had happened. After watching the movie, that was the question that I had, because my assumption going in, and I will preface this by saying I didn't know a lot going in. I think I'd seen maybe one trailer, and peripherally I knew that this was a movie and it was supposed to be, sort of about the Star Wars universe is writ large. We have the epic struggle between good and evil, the monomyth, etc., and this was going to try and dig into those small people. We know that the clash between the Empire and the Rebels is going on, but, what about those folks who are, scrubbing toilets for the Rebel Alliance? I didn't think it was going to be quite that. I knew, obviously, it was still part of the Star Wars movie universe. I would watch that movie.
But, what I was disappointed by, two things. First of all of the characters died. Spoiler, all of the characters died. From a larger experience that includes all sorts of science fiction, that includes representations of war in all media, whether it's science fictional or not, I thought that was a great decision. In terms of a decision for this movie, I had kind of a hard time making myself okay with that, because it felt because this movie didn't really matter in the overall arc of the universe, we know what happens with the Death Star. We know that Carrie Fisher, Princess Leia gets the plans and they blow up the Death Star, and then 2 movies later they blow it up again because the Empire builds another one. And so the movie couldn't really rest on its plot. It really needed to focus on its characters and the character development in order to get me invested in what was going on. And, I had some problems with the character development. But overall, I thought it did a pretty decent job of, trying to shift its focus to that. But then having everyone die by the end, it felt like that meant that the importance had to be on the overall story, or it had to be on the contribution of those characters to the universe. And it felt a little flat in that way for me. And I'll add on top of that, the second problem that I had is that I didn't want to see Darth Vader in this movie. I didn't want to see Princess Leia. I didn't want to see, what's his name? The skeletal looking British guy who was in charge of the Death Star. Tarkin. I didn't want to see him. Like, this was not their story. We have seen their story. I get that some of these characters knew about them or interacted with them or whatever, but that was not this story. This story should have been about Jyn Erso and the other characters who we did not know. And by taking the focus away from them, even by focusing on the Empire guy, who was in charge of the project. What was his name? The Aryan guy.
You're talking about Krennic.
Yeah, Krennic. Even by focusing on Krennic and by having all of his development as a character bounce off of these established characters, both Tarkin and Darth Vader, I didn't care about him at all. Because I'm like, well, I know about Darth Vader, and I know about Tarkin, and I know that they don't mention you at all, so therefore you don't matter. And therefore I didn't care. And so those were sort of the problems that I had going away from this movie. That it had been, kind of an enjoyable experience, but I'm going to say it kind of also felt like it had wasted my time a little bit. And see, again, I have a hard time saying that because on a level outside of the Star Wars universe, I thought that this as a science fiction war story on the ground, kind of bleak, all the characters die by the end, was a smart decision. But in terms of the Star Wars universe, I don't think this movie made a lot of smart decisions in how it executed it.
That's so interesting, because I do come out on the polar opposite end of pretty much every argument you've posed there.
Awesome.
So just like a couple of my objections would be Tarkin.
Yeah.
Tarkin and Leia and several of the other characters who reappear, who've been sort of digitally constructed to look the same age as they were in the original series. That I admit was a little like on the nose. Darth Vader, Leia, Tarkin, the general who yells "It's a trap!" or the admiral. I don't remember what he is. The person who,
Admiral Radish.
Yes, Admiral. Yes, whatever. Anyway, so all of those characters reappearing. That was fan service. And on one level, I'm like, oh, cool. We get that, like, fan service in there. And on the other hand, I'm like, I didn't really need that for the plot. Okay. I think if you subtract the fan service, Krennic to me was really interesting as a bad guy because he is the first Imperial person who actually does a decent job. Like, he does a good job. He's kind of impotent in a certain sense. Like, he doesn't have the power to stand up to Tarkin or Darth Vader. He gets told off by both of them. There's even a finger shake in there at him. But in terms of, like, making intuitive leaps, he doesn't wait for, like, a memo to arrive to tell him that Galen Erso has betrayed them or how to go about eliciting information from his sources or getting people to do what he wants them to do. He is actually cunningly manipulative, and he's efficient, and he goes to the right place. Even if he doesn't manage to win the day at the end, he goes to the right place to be in on the action at the end, which Tarkin didn't even do that in the original series, and he was the most menacing of the non-Sith bad guys in the entire entire Star Wars original series. So I think he was an interesting character. Was he the most compelling bad guy on the planet? No, he's not a Bond villain. That's fine. That's okay. I personally loved every single character in Jyn Erso's team. I do regret that maybe there wasn't a little bit more of gender balance there. However, each individual character was a gem, and I loved the relationship between Baze and Chirrut. I thought that was really that was the beating heart of the sort of side character stories going on in this movie, and that really moved me that they allowed these characters to to just display a warmth for each other, a compassion, a real care for each other's welfare, when so many other characters in the Star Wars universe really are just kind of along for the ride, and you don't get that rich interaction. Jyn Erso's relationship with Cassian Andor, the rebel agent, is also very interesting because it changes him, and because you see her function like the character in Contact. Remind me of her name.
Ellie Arroway.
Yeah, Ellie Arroway's Cassian Andor into coming on board her mission, into having a more understanding of the possibilities open to him as a person of character, a person with a conscience. And I thought that was really masterful. So I like the characters. That's not the same as me saying every decision made with the characters was the right one. However, I do like them, and I found them compelling. So a lot of what you think of the characters, and therefore the story and the importance of the story, is going to come down to whether you connect to Jyn Erso and really buy into her or not. And so it'll be interesting to see, whether things trend one way or the other in terms of, especially young people. I'm really curious how young women and young men receive this film, because we haven't had a lot of like war movies for young people recently, in science fiction or otherwise.
Right.
We have a lot of dystopian films, but we don't have a lot of like war movies. So that'll be interesting. And in terms of its importance to the general Star Wars storyline, no, we always knew what was going to happen after this movie. What happened to the characters in the movie is another matter. But I think what they were trying to do with the standalones was first satisfy a franchise need, which is Disney has taken over this franchise. They need to introduce something new in order to justify to their fans and to Star Wars fans that it's okay that they took over, that they're going to do something new. They're not just going to keep reinventing the wheel. Because if I have any objections to The Force Awakens, it's that it's very much in the same vein as the original series. Like, it does a fantastic job of it, and I love it to bits. But it doesn't really do anything new in terms of, like, changing the tone or inventing more diverse philosophies and that sort of a thing. So I think they were trying to demonstrate as a company that they could do something with this franchise that we haven't seen before that still honors the original material. I don't think it was probably the wisest choice for the first standalone film, but a lot of how that shakes out is which script makes it out of production hell first. So we have another one coming up, which is Star Wars Rebels, and it will be the origin story of Han Solo. That might have been a better one to start with.
And I get why they would have started here, because as much as I was just saying that I had problems with the familiarity, and therefore problems taking the characters that this movie presented on their own merits, I think that it was smart to start in a place that is so iconic, not just in the Star Wars universe, but in, film generally, in science fiction generally, starting, with Leia's ship escaping from the Star Destroyer, as, the first glimpse we get of the Star Wars universe in Star Wars A New Hope is just, it seems really smart to go back to that moment from an out of universe perspective, from the perspective of like, how do you both reinvent the franchise, keep it new, and yet ground it entirely in what's worked before and what people know and like best about it?
Yeah. I think that's spot on. I think if we look at Rogue One as an experiment, as a kind of growing pains possibility where the franchise and the company are trying to work out their relationship to each other, it'll be a rich vein for analysis in the future as we watch Disney take on this new thing for who knows how many decades. I mean, this could be the next Marvel Cinematic Universe sort of thing, and it could grow beyond its ability to tell good stories like the Marvel Universe has. Or it could, by continuously doing these one-shots and interspersing the episodes with one-shots like this in Rebels, it could test new ideas, be like, hey, that worked, or that really didn't work at all, and make the episodes themselves better. So the sequel to The Force Awakens will probably look back at this film, Rogue One, and say, these are some things that we did that maybe we shouldn't repeat, and maybe these are good moves. So if you look at it as an experiment, it's a little bit more interesting as like maybe enriching our understanding of the world that created Star Wars as opposed to the world of Star Wars. And so like we're close to needing to wrap ourselves up here on the podcast.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Rogue One is going to really appeal to some people. Maybe people who are really ready to be pleased, like I am. And it's really not going to appeal to others. Can you think of any sort of metric to determine who's going to fall into which camp?
I think that one of the biggest differences between us, going back to our experiences with Star Wars that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, is just that you're a larger fan of Star Wars than I am. And I'm kind of like, I was on the fence about it. I don't really I don't go into a Star Wars movie really wanting to like it. I went into The Force Awakens and I was pleasantly surprised by some of the things that it did. And I think honestly, if the order had been reversed, I would have gone into Rogue One having not seen The Force Awakens and been much more pleasantly surprised by a lot of what it did. But because Star Wars has become an ongoing thing now for me, it was almost too much. Like, I did not ask to see 2 new Star Wars movies in like a little bit less than a year. And so I think I would have a very different reaction to this if it was the first new piece of Star Wars property that I'd seen since the last of the prequels back in like 2000, whatever that was, like 10 plus years ago.
Yeah. It's been a while. It's been over a decade since, I last saw a prequel film in theaters, and the experience today, the expectations we have are so different from when those prequels were coming out, when it was George Lucas and everyone was expecting like something that really continued the tone and the vigor of the original series, and then what you got was this long sort of historical epic in a sense. And there are moments in the prequel series that I really love. I think the moment when Padme turns to, I don't remember who it is, but she's in the Senate and they've just gone over to the Palpatine, and she says, "This is how freedom dies," in thunderous applause or whatever it is. And there's a lot of the prequel series that speaks to modern politics in an interesting way, the same way that Rogue One does, I think. Whereas films like the original series and The Force Awakens, they're looking ahead to something else, and they're not really concerned with explicitly engaging contemporary politics. So it'll be interesting to see how things play out. But in the long run, dear listeners, we hope that you'll stick around as we watch our way through the new installments of Star Wars, as well as there's a lot of great science fiction coming out in 2017 on the big screen. I don't know if you're excited, but I'm very excited. We have a lot of wonderful things lined up. So stick around. We will be discussing some more books in the near future. And we will also be discussing some more films, as we've already mentioned. Probably in past podcasts, we've got Hidden Figures coming out very soon, and we'll be talking about that as well. So,
for sure.
Okay, so thank you for listening to us today. You can find us and all of our podcasts, at least our most recent ones, on SoundCloud, iTunes, and we are also on Twitter at
Imaginary_pod.
The thing I keep forgetting, Imaginary_pod. And you can also find us online at our blog and website, www.imaginaries.us. So, go forth, and may the force be with you, ?
Quite.
Catch you later, guys.
All right, bye.